Hello guys, today we'll be covering a 2012 thriller film called Chained. Brad Fittler drops off his wife Sarah and his son at the movie theaters and specifically instructs her to take a cab back home. After the movie, Sarah gets into a cab with her son to return back home. But as the cab is moving forward, Sarah notices that the driver has missed their exit. Even after her reminder, the driver does not respond to her and keeps on driving. She tries contacting her husband, but she's unable to reach him. At this point, Sarah starts freaking out and threatens the driver to report him to the police. The cab pulls up into a garage of an isolated house in the middle of nowhere. Then the man drags Sarah inside the house, leaving the little boy in the cab. As he sits in the car all alone, all he can do is cry as he hears his mother screaming inside the house. After a while, the man comes out to get the boy. He drags the kid out of the car and brings him into the house. As a retaliation, the boy throws a kick at him. But due to this, he's not allowed to have dinner that night. With tears in his eyes, the boy asks for his mom, but the man replies that she's never coming back. This mysterious man is Bob, and he's not an ordinary cab driver. He's a psychopathic serial killer who stalks women in the city street, and if he has the chance, he kidnaps them. He then takes them to his remote house, assaults them physically, and finally murders them. Now Bob plans to keep the boy as his slave who will be cleaning his house, serving him, and will be helping him to bury the dead bodies in the cellar. To make things easier for him, Bob names the kid Rabbit. To survive in this hell, Rabbit will have to do whatever Bob orders him to do. He then explains that Rabbit needs to open the door within 10 seconds of hearing the buzzer, because that's when Bob will be home with a new victim. He tells the boy that he'll need to find the stories of missing people in the newspaper and paste them neatly in the scrapbook. The man also warns the boy never to betray him by trying to run or steal from him. 8 weeks after the incident, Bob orders Rabbit to put the news articles about his mother's disappearance into the scrapbook. Unable to bear the torture any longer, Rabbit gets ready to escape that day. He climbs up the cupboard and reaches the attic through a small hole in the ceiling. Then, breaking the wooden blinds of a small window, he steps outside on the roof. But Bob is right outside, watching him come out to the roof. Rabbit cries for help at the top of his lungs, but miles and miles away, there's not a single soul to hear his cry. Bob tells Rabbit to come down and give his best shot to run away. Having no options left, the boy starts to descend, while Bob starts throwing rocks at him. Eventually, getting hit by the rocks, Rabbit collapses on the ground. Now, Rabbit's no longer free, even within the house. He's chained up and under surveillance at all times. Every night or so, the man brings home a screaming woman, and Rabbit helplessly watches the man assault his helpless victims before finally killing them. He has no other choice than to obediently follow the man's orders. Oftentimes, Bob allows Rabbit to watch the television with him, and sometimes Bob would give him a chocolate as a reward for his performance. Days turn into weeks, and weeks into years, and over time, the little Rabbit has grown into a teenager. One day, Bob is driving an angry father and his son in the cab. When this man loses his cool, he hits his son, which triggers Bob to have flashbacks of his own past life. Unable to focus, he becomes agitated and returns home. Sensing that Bob is not in a good mood, Rabbit serves him a bottle of cold beer. Now he wants Rabbit to learn things about people. According to Bob, without education, people will trample all over them. He then brings out a book and tells him to study so that in the near future they can work together and maybe have some freedom. Now that the boy is a grown-up, Bob suggests Rabbit have a taste of a woman soon. Bob tries to become a father figure and wants Rabbit to follow in his footsteps, but Rabbit objects to the idea of toying with women and killing them afterward. Bob loses his temper and reveals that his dad had remarried and is happy with his new wife. But this does not seem to affect Rabbit, as he asks Bob if he can still read the books. Bob helps Rabbit maintain his hygiene and keeps him well-groomed. While Bob is out searching for women to kill, Rabbit spends his time studying the anatomy of the human body. Then, at night, Bob does an assessment of his studies. Most of the evenings, Rabbit shuts his ears to muffle the ear-piercing screams. But this day, a wounded girl makes it out of Bob's room, searching for the exit. When she asks Rabbit for his help, right at that time, Bob stabs the girl in the neck, instantly killing her. The following day, Bob asks Rabbit to stitch the cut on his face left behind by a woman. Later, bringing out the license collected from the victims, he calls Rabbit to play a game. He then distributes the driver's license like a normal deck of cards. In this weird game, one gives out the name of the victim by looking at the card, while the other has to tell the victim's information. By the look of it, it seems that this is not the first time they're playing this game. Later, while sorting out the victim's belongings, Rabbit finds a knife in a bag. He takes the knife and goes to stand in front of Bob's room. For some reason, the man is shrieking in agony. Bob is having flashbacks of his teenage years when he was assaulted by his father. He has a little brother with whom he shares the room. But one day, without a care in the world, his abusive father forces him to leave the room for his brother and himself. But even after all of this, his mother chose to run to his abusive father. This sick incident has left him with a mental scar for life. One night, the buzzer does not ring, and no woman is screaming or being dragged by the man. It turns out that the woman is intoxicated and, for obvious reasons, acting a bit crazy. Bob couldn't stand this annoying girl, and he slits her throat in front of Rabbit. As the girl is struggling for her life, Rabbit replies, "Carotid artery," as if Bob is putting him on a test every day. Then Rabbit goes to bury the woman's body. But today, he has a hard time sleeping and is troubled by nightmares. The next day, Bob brings a school yearbook and hands it to the boy. He wants Rabbit to choose a girl for himself, but Rabbit retaliates and puts the book on the floor. Even after asking him to pick it up, the team refuses to do so. Angered by his disobedience, Bob grabs him by the neck and makes him pick it up. After spending most of his life with Rabbit, it seems like the man has considered him to be his own kid. Then he orders Rabbit not to make a noise for the rest of the night. But shortly after, Bob comes up to him, pulls out his leg, and with a simple click and snap, unlocks the chain that's been attached to Rabbit's leg all this time. During their conversation, Rabbit asks Bob why he's into kidnappings and murders. In response, the man simply tells him that the girls make him do that. But Rabbit tells him that all the women he killed never asked to be murdered. Turns out that Bob has this weird mummy issue from the past, so he considers every woman to be a whore. Since Rabbit has lost touch with the outer world, Bob thinks that he's not able to understand these things. Once again, he mentions that Rabbit is old enough to have a taste of a woman and forces the boy to pick a girl from the yearbook. And later that night, he brings a girl named Angie. Bob brings Rabbit into the room where Angie's been locked up and threatens to kill her if she does not obey Rabbit's orders. Then he gives Rabbit a knife and walks out of the room. Now that it's just the two of them inside, Rabbit drops the knife and tells her that he does not want to hurt her. Immediately, Angie comes to know that Rabbit is held against his will in the house. Then she tells him that he can do whatever he wants to do with her, if that's what it takes to get out. Rabbit could not do anything with Angie, but when Bob suddenly comes in, he stabs her in the stomach. Pretending that Bob disturbed his mood, Rabbit shouts at him to go away. Once Bob is gone, he tells Angie that he's missed her vital organs and the wound is not a fatal one. He asks her to pretend to be dead so that he can hide her in the cellar. Angie trusts him and does what Rabbit had asked for. With sleepy eyes, Bob sees Rabbit dragging the supposedly dead body to the burial room. After taking care of the body, Rabbit returns to Bob and says that he wants to hunt. The next day, Bob prepares a fresh set of suits for Rabbit. He then brings a new chair and places it near his own chair. Throughout his years, Rabbit has always sat on the floor while he's watching television with Bob, but this new chair signifies that he can now sit on the same level as Bob. Now Bob takes Rabbit to the garage, and for the first time in such a long time, Rabbit sees the yellow car again. Suddenly, it reminds him of the horrible memories associated with it. He takes Rabbit for a ride to the city and tells him about the different types of women in the world. Bob then tells him that once they get home, they'll watch the recording where Rabbit's getting laid. Rabbit had no idea that he was being recorded that night. Thinking that his secret will be exposed tonight, he's scared out of his mind and tries to talk him into not watching the recording. On their way, Bob notices the help written on the side of his car. It turns out Rabbit sneakily wrote the sign while he was looking at the back passenger seat earlier. Bob gets mad at him for trying to act smart and hits him. At that moment, he figures out that Rabbit might not have killed Angie, so he hurries back home. As soon as they get back home, Bob knocks out the defenseless Rabbit and locks the door behind them. Shouting Angie's name, he reaches the cellar and takes out the hidden knife from his sock. Taking advantage of the dark, Angie attacks Bob and slices his heel. Meanwhile, Rabbit gives it his all to open the door with a crowbar. Eventually, he arrives in that dark room where Angie and Bob are in the middle of a scuffle. However, during the fight, Angie's cast aside in a motionless state. Immediately, Rabbit pounces on Bob, and after struggling for a while, he finally positions a knife at his jowls just below the neck. Bob underestimates Rabbit and tells him that he can't do it, and subsequently, the knife penetrates his neck and his last words could never be completed. Fortunately, Angie is still alive as she calls out to Rabbit for his help, and later on, after Angie falls asleep, Rabbit buries Bob and puts the scrapbook on top of his grave. The next day, Rabbit comes to visit his father, Brad, who's living a happy life with his new wife, Marie, and her son. At first, Brad does not recognize him, but after mentioning things about the past, he pretends to be happy with Tim's return. We now know that Rabbit's real name is Tim. As Brad is pretending to be delighted, Tim confronts him for being the mastermind behind the abduction of him and his mother. Brad sends his wife and son upstairs, but sensing the graveness of the situation, she comes down to eavesdrop on them. Tim knows that Brad is Bob's brother. While being held captive at Bob's house, Tim found a letter and a bank check from Brad, telling Bob to get rid of Sarah and her son. In response to the accusation, Brad reveals his psychotic side and starts hitting him. When his wife intervenes, Brad does not even spare her and starts ravaging her as well. Experiencing violence once again, Tim is triggered by the memories of Bob aggressively abusing his victims. As a result, he goes berserk and starts hitting Brad with a sharp object. Then he lands one last blow, which ultimately takes Brad's life. Marie urges Tim to leave, and afterward, she calls the police to report a burglary. She lies and tells the cops that the burglar might have killed her husband as well. Finally, as the movie comes to an end, Tim returns to Bob's house and closes the garage door.